Imagine that you quit your job, start a business, but the product that you invent is laughed at and rejected by every manufacturer and buyer that you meet. In fact, you only have $5,000 left to your name when you are in a room with a buyer of a major retail chain, probably the last opportunity you have of making your non-existent company into a real business. However, this buyer is losing interest. Your data, your slides, your logic are not working. What do you do in that situation? Well, this was the situation that Sarah Blakely faced. And her solution was saying,
"Hey, I know this sounds weird, but would you mind coming with me to the women's bathroom?"
It's indeed a little bit weird, but once you realize what Sarah was doing, you'll understand that she was actually relying on one of the oldest and most reliable techniques for conveying information that there is. And no, it's not accompanying another woman to the bathroom, but rather it's using personal stories. Once in the bathroom, she explained to the female buyer why she invented Spanx. She explained the frustrations and the awkwardness of wearing traditional pantyhose underneath business pants. And then she did a show and tell. She demonstrated the traditional pantyhose on their pants, looked awful, and then she demonstrated by comparison her newly invented Spanx, which looked a lot better. By the time that conversation was over, despite all the weirdness and awkwardness, she came out with a contract to sell her product in Neiman Marcus, which is one of the high-end retailers in the world. The rest was history, and Sarah Blakely today has $1 billion empire built around this product. So in a past video, I talked about the power of personal stories as one of the ways of conveying information effectively. And today we'll focus on the how. We'll break down how we should tell personal stories for maximum effect. For Sarah Blakely, it was worth an opportunity of a lifetime, and it could be for you as well. So stick around to learn how to use the power of personal stories to communicate so that people are impressed and inspired. Now, there's a lot to like about personal stories as a communication technique. They raise curiosity, they lower defenses, and they make your audience clearly envision your message, which is a key step to convincing them that your message is right. But the key is that you have to tell personal stories in the right way. Now, I've taught and coached thousands of MBA students and executives on communication skills, and here are my top tips to using them effectively. So tip number one, the first question you want to ask is, how do you know which story to tell? Or even more basic, how do you find stories to tell? Well, there are three ways broadly to find stories. The first one is being observant of interesting things that happen in your life. Anything that catches your attention, brings up emotion, or was a key event in a decision you make is a candidate to become a story. The second way to find a story is being observant of interesting things that happen in the lives of people who are close to you. Anything that happens to other people and has the basic element of a story, which is it grabs your attention, it connects with you emotionally, and it's related to a key event or decision that they made, can be breeding grounds for how you tell your story. And it's okay if the story is not about your life. The point here is not to share about your life, but rather to find a great story to make your point. Third and finally, you can just take an existing story that you heard from another person. It's okay to copy in the realm of spoken stories. Spoken stories are not like intellectual property, and in fact, many people would feel complimented if you are actually retelling their stories. So 95% of personal stories come from these three sources. Tip number two, there are countless stories out there, but they all fall into a few specific patterns. The thing is, people have been telling stories to each other for thousands of years. That used to be the main way of learning in society. It still is to some extent, although we have other ways like books, for example. When you do anything for that long a time, patterns emerge. So a story is not just a collection of facts or statements. It's a sequence of events that has some sort of causal link between them. It has main characters that interact with these events, and it has a conflict or a problem that the character has to respond to as part of the story. Now, it turns out that most stories follow one of 5 simple patterns, and we call them archetypes. And so when you use a story to drive home your point, you should know these 5 archetypes and fit your story into one of them, because people are predisposed to respond to them. So I have a separate video on these story archetypes if you want to dig deep, but let me quickly summarize them here. So we have the first archetype, which is rags to riches. This is the story of somebody who starts out low, ends up high by pushing through setbacks along the way. This fits Sarah Blakely's story from the beginning of this video. The second archetype is overcoming the monster. These stories are about a person who faces their biggest fear or obstacle through courage and smarts. The third type of story is the quest. This is a story where a strong drive pushes a person into achieving a faraway goal that seemed impossible at the beginning of the journey. The fourth type of story is voyage and return. This is a story where a person goes away into an unfamiliar environment, becomes a better person in that environment, and then returns to their home environment and original challenges, but this time they're renewed and able to handle those challenges because of the experience. And the fifth archetype of a story is the story of redemption. This is where a person makes a big mistake or does something seriously wrong morally, but learns from it and changes for the better. Now, for you, this means that you want to map whatever story you're telling into one of these archetypes. What you want to do is write down your story in bullet points, and you want to map it out exactly into the archetype that you think it's closest to. These bullet points should cover the key components of the archetype that you choose. This will make it a lot easier to practice telling your story because you'll know what key inflection points to hit. The third tip is always have a point for why you're telling the story. So make sure you have a clear point to make. Make sure you have something very specific that you want to convince other people of. The thing is, stories are so compelling that people will listen to a story even without a point at the end of it, because stories are so interesting and we're pre-wired to listen to them. However, if you don't have a clear point to your story, that would be a wasted opportunity. The story has to relate in some way to the point that you're trying to get across, but it doesn't have to nail it exactly. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Dave Ramsey, in his live talks, often pulls out an old yellowing Bible and talks about his great-great-grandfather who was a preacher and used that very Bible during the American Civil War. The reason he does that is as a way of talking about building a legacy. And his key point is that by making better financial decisions, you can change your family tree. Now, the link from his Bible story about his great-great-grandfather to the point that he's trying to make is not quite airtight, okay? It's not the most logical, but it probably doesn't matter because the story remains effective. The story is sufficiently connected to the point he's trying to make. And so the story makes it interesting, makes people curious, and then he gets to make his point, which is better financial decisions now would lead to lasting legacy in your family. So in other words, you definitely want to have a point to your story, and you definitely want to have the point connected to the story, but the connection doesn't have to be airtight. It can be loosely connected. Tip number 4 is about practice. It might seem like great storytellers do it off the cuff, but in fact, you need tremendous amounts of practice in order to look natural. Once you have the key element of a story nailed down, it's just time to practice, practice, practice. The more you tell and retell your story, the easier it will be to appear like you're doing it naturally, which is a key to being perceived as charismatic. Also, more practice telling one story helps you become a better storyteller in general, because you become better at identifying the right tempo, the right cadence, and the key elements of stories in general. So practice telling stories as much as possible. The goal is for you to practice any particular story so many times that it becomes automatic. So you know by heart the content, the versions, the adjustments, everything. That's the goal. The next tip is that you want to have different versions of your story. Specifically, you want to have a long version and a short version. Sometimes you have the time and space and the expectation to take up a few minutes of people's time and attention, and therefore you'll have the time to tell the long version of the story. However, sometimes you only have a minute or even a few seconds to tell your story, and so you want to have the short version. It's much harder to tell a short story and have it be effective than to tell a longer story where you have time to recover from mistakes. So you want to practice two versions. One is a short one and one is a long one. The shorter one will just have the key elements of the plot, character, and conflict organized according to one of the 5 story archetypes. The longer version will have additional details and characters that bring the story to life and make it more vivid and interesting. The next tip is you want to have a bank of stories in literally a Dropbox folder or a cloud folder. You see, great storytellers don't rely just on their memory to be able to come up with a story. They collect great stories and look back at them periodically and then even iterate on them to improve them. The practice of collecting and recording stories is the secret to why some people seem to be so charismatic and always seem to be able to find the right things to say in every situation. The thing is, what they've done is not magic. They've been preparing and banking and practicing their stories for years. So chances are, whatever situation they find themselves in, they have a story that is relevant. The next tip is you want to have a clear understanding of what feedback means when it comes to stories. Obviously, when you're telling and iterating and practicing your stories, you're doing that to get some kind of feedback. But what's important is it's not like performance feedback or grades where somebody else tells you specifically what's working and what's not working. Stories operate on a completely different level. The way people respond to stories is far less deliberative and much more unconscious. What you're looking for when you tell a story is to what extent your audience appears to be riveted or glued to every word that you're saying, or following along with focused attention and going through some kind of an emotional experience when you're telling them the story. The feedback you get will come from observing your audience as you tell the story and right afterwards, not from explicitly asking them, how did it go? We rarely can articulate why a good story keeps us interested, but we definitely show it in our behavior. So when it comes to storytelling, feedback comes from observing your audience, not from asking them how it went. The next tip is, to the extent that you can, you want to show, not just tell. The old saying is that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And of course, in this case, you have to use words because you are actually telling somebody a story. But you could still create a visual even with your words. For example, instead of saying something like, I was nervous when I opened that email, you can say something like, my hands were literally shaking when I opened that email. The second version is far more visual than the first version. Or another example, instead of saying something like, my manager is really harsh with me, you can say something like, I wrote a memo, sent it over to my manager, but the next day I come to the office, I see the printed memo on my desk from my manager with a big giant red X all over the front page. Again, the second version, far more visual than the first version. The idea is to remember and mention these concrete, vivid details because these details increase interest and capture attention just like a photograph or a movie would. Now, these details are not central to your point or central to the story, but they really help in making your story compelling. Now remember, if you have a short amount of time and you are using the short version of your story, then these ornate details will probably have to be cut. Even though in the long version of the story, these details would be amazing to have. So if you can, try to show with your words, not just tell. Another tip might sound odd, but here goes. Enjoy telling the story. This is because the things that we enjoy, we do more of. So if you enjoy storytelling, that's the best way to make sure that you do it over and over again and get better and better at it. Now, it might seem weird to have a tip that tells you to enjoy something because usually we think about enjoyment as something that just happens to us. It's not something we can control. But in reality, there are ways to enjoy things intentionally. When it comes to storytelling, one thing we can do is focusing on the most positive aspects of storytelling, which is usually other people's positive reactions when we tell them a story. So when you are telling a story, try to focus on those things. Try to notice the smiles, the nods, the energy that says, tell me more. Doing this will paint your experience in a very positive color and make you enjoy it. Because who doesn't like social approval? And a great way to get social approval is by telling an interesting story. It's like a shot of dopamine. And then the more you enjoy delivering the story, the more you'll tell it over and over again, and the better you'll become. It will become a virtuous cycle at the end. So if you follow these tips, you'll be able to hold the attention of people in any room and master one of the most effective ways of communicating and persuading, which is the personal story. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Becoming a better storyteller is often your key to success, leveling up, making a sale, being promoted, being hired, and all these wonderful things that can happen in your professional life. So good luck, and I'll see you in the next one.